Without further ado, we'll start with Ed. Ed Pavlic is here from the University of Georgia, and a wonderful Baldwin scholar, but also poet, and has some great stuff that he'll be reading from the Book of Poetry. Introduce yourself.
Just want to thank everyone for coming. As I say at all the events that I do with literary arts, poetry, etc., the world is a very busy, busy place, and sometimes difficult to make the space for the literary imagination. But in the case of James Baldwin, a little easier to make the space. I'm going to read from Baldwin's final novel, Just Above My Head. I'm going to read from a piece of that novel which occurs near the end. I'd say he began to write this book maybe when he was 8, I don't know, or maybe in 1975 or thereabouts, and finished it and published it in 1979. The two characters in this section, Arthur Montana, the main character of the book, is a gospel singer, a very famous and politically engaged gospel singer who has also had a career in soul music. And he has stolen a weekend to himself and absconded from his schedule in a certain way that has something in common with what James Baldwin was known to do from time to time when he needed it. And he's met up with a Frenchman named Guy, and they have this weekend together. And in it, in my mind, Baldwin arrives at some very interesting some places that culminate in certain ways his massive and fantastically important work. Yes, my brother was happy. Oh, and the narrator is Arthur Montana's older brother, Hal. Yes, my brother was happy. I wish I had been there. I'm glad that I could not have been there. I could not have seen, he could not have seen, if I had been there, though I could have seen it, of course, that he was happy because he made Guy happy. He has never known himself to make anyone happy before. He does not really know this now, yet here it is before him, Guy's radiant face, Guy with those deep-set brown eyes, that just beginning to be weathered brow, that rough red curly hair. Above all, the delight in those eyes when they look at Arthur. Guy sees in Arthur what Arthur would not dream of looking for in Guy. The stubborn anguish Guy sees in Arthur corroborates Guy's reality, may be said even to give him the right to live. It begins to divest him of his irksome privilege, his blinding color, and welcomes him, so to speak, into the human race. Thus, he can, he hopes, he imagines, meet Arthur on Arthur's ground. But there is absolutely no point in attempting to meet Arthur on Arthur's ground. In any way, Guy cannot do this. Not yet. And Arthur knows it. It is not because he cannot know Arthur's ground, but because he does not know his own. Guy and Arthur may be equally lonely, but Guy is far more isolated. Arthur is far more a stranger for Guy than Guy can be for Arthur, at least in principle and as the result of history. Guy has said that his history is clean to him, but what he means is that he has no acceptable access to that history. It cannot feed him. It can only diminish him. In any case, it must all be re-examined and overhauled before it can possibly be used, and this examination will take the rest of Guy's life. Guy, like many other, like Arthur, like you and me, in fact, would rather spend his life without wrestling with history. To overhaul a history, or attempt to redeem it, which effort may or may not justify it, is not at all the same thing as the descent one must make in order to excavate a history. To be forced to excavate a history is also to repudiate the concept of history. The vocabulary in which history is written, for the written history is and must be merely the vocabulary of power. And power is history's most seductively attired false witness. And yet, the attempt, more the necessity, to excavate a history, to find the truth about oneself, is motivated by the need to have the power to force others to recognize your presence, your right to be here, power. The disputed passage will remain disputed so long as you do not have the authority of the right-of-way, so long, that is, as your passage can be disputed. The document promising safe passage can always be revoked. Power clears the passage swiftly, but the paradox here is that power, rooted in history, is also the mockery and repudiation of history. The power to define the other seals one's definition of oneself. Who, then, in such a fearful mathematic, to use Guy's term, is trapped? Perhaps, then, after all, we have no idea what history is, or are in flight from the demon we have summoned. Perhaps history is not to be found in our mirrors, but in our repudiations. Perhaps the other is ourselves. History may be a great deal more than the quicksand which swallows others, and which has yet to swallow us. History may be attempting to vomit us up and spew us out. History may be tired. Death itself, which swallows everyone, is beginning to be weary of history. In fact, for death has no history. Our history is each other. That is our only guide. One thing is absolutely certain. One can repudiate or despise no one's history without repudiating and despising one's own. Perhaps that is what the gospel singer is singing.
As you know, each day we've had students from the James Baldwin School, James Baldwin High School, right around the corner over here. And today we have Vahimir Emile.
My name is Vahimir Emile. I'm a senior at the James Baldwin School. Today I'm going to be reading Notes of a Native Son. Mr. Baldwin, I believe one of his key attributes was that he had a very observational nature. I believe this piece highlights that nature. I had returned home around the second week in June, in great haste because it seemed that my father's death and my mother's confinement were both but a matter of hours. In the case of my mother, it soon became clear that she had simply made a miscalculation. This had always been her tendency, and I don't believe that a single one of us arrived in the world, or has since arrived anywhere else on time. But none of us dawdled so intolerably about the business of being bored as did my baby sister. We sometimes amused ourselves during those endless stifling weeks by picturing the baby sitting within the safe, warm, dark, bitterly regretting the necessity of becoming part of our chaos and stubbornly putting it off as long as possible. I understood her perfectly and congratulated her on showing such good sense so soon. Death, however, sat as purposefully at my father's bedside as life stirred within my mother's womb, and it was harder to understand why he so lingered in that long shadow. It seemed that he had bent, and for a long time too, all of his energies towards dying. Now death was ready for him, but my father held back. All of Harlem indeed seemed to be infected by waiting. I had never before known it to be so violently still. Racial tensions throughout this country were exacerbated during the early years of the war, partly because the labor market brought together hundreds of thousands of ill-prepared people, and partly because Negro soldiers, regardless of where they were born, received their military training in the South. What happened in defense plants and army camps had repercussions, naturally, in every Negro ghetto. The situation in Harlem had grown bad enough for clergymen, policemen, educators, politicians, and social workers to assert in one breath that there was no crime wave, and to offer in the very next breath suggestions as to how to combat it. These suggestions always seemed to involve playgrounds, despite the fact that racial skirmishes were occurring in the playgrounds, too. Playground or not, crime wave or not, the Harlem police force had been augmented in March, and the unrest grew, perhaps in fact partly as a result of the ghetto's instinctive hatred of policemen. Perhaps the most revealing news item out of the steady parade of reports of muggings, stabbings, shootings, assaults, gang wars, and accusations of police brutality is the item concerning 6 Negro girls who set upon a white girl in the subway because, as they all too accurately put it, she was stepping on their toes. Indeed she was, all over the nation. I had never before been so aware of policemen on foot, on horseback, on corners, everywhere, always 2 by 2. Nor had I ever been so aware of small knots of people. They were on stoops and on corners and in doorways, and what was striking about them, I think, was that they did not seem to be talking. Never when I passed these groups did the usual sound of a curse or a laugh ring out, and neither did there seem to be any hum of gossip. There was certainly, on the other hand, occurring between them communication extraordinarily intense. Another thing that was striking was the unexpected diversity of the people who made up these groups. Usually, for example, one would see a group of Sharpies standing on the street corner driving the passing chicks, or a group of older men, usually for some reason in the vicinity of a barber shop, discussing baseball scores, or the numbers, or making rather chilling observations about women they had known. Women in a general way tended to be seen less often together, unless they were churchwomen or very young girls, or prostitutes met together for an unprofessional instant. But that summer, I saw the strangest combinations. Large, respectable, churchly matrons standing on the stoops or the corners with their hair tied up, together with a girl in a sleazy satin whose face bore the marks of gin and the razor, or heavy-set, abrupt, no-nonsense older men in company with the most disreputable and fanatical race men, or these same race men with the Sharpies, or these Sharpies with the churchly women. Seventh-day Adventists and Methodists and Spiritualists seemed to be hobnobbing with holy rollers, and they were all alike, entangled with the most flagrant disbelievers. Something heavy in their stance seemed to indicate that they had all incredibly seen a common vision, and on each face there seemed to be the same strange, bitter shadow. The churchly women and the matter-of-fact, no-nonsense men had children in the army. The sleazy girls they talked to had lovers there. The Sharpies and the race men had friends and brothers there. It would have demanded an unquestioning patriotism, happily as uncommon in this country as it is undesirable for these people not to have been disturbed by the bitter letters they received, by the newspaper stories they read, not to have been enraged by the posters then to be found all over New York, which described the Japanese as yellow-bellied Japs. It was only the racemen, to be sure, who spoke ceaselessly of being revenged. How this vengeance was to be exacted was not clear, for the indignities and dangers suffered by Negro boys in uniform, but everybody felt a directionless, hopeless bitterness, as well as that panic which can scarcely be suppressed when one knows that a human being one loves is beyond one's reach and in danger. This helplessness and this gnawing uneasiness does something at length to even the toughest mind. Perhaps the best way to sum all this up is to say that the people I knew felt mainly a peculiar kind of relief when they knew that their boys were being shipped out of the South to do battle overseas. It was perhaps like feeling that the most dangerous part of a dangerous journey had been passed, and that now, even if death should come, it would come with honor and without the complicity of their countrymen. Such death would be, in short, a fact with which one could hope to live. It was on the 20th of July, which I believe was a Wednesday, that I visited my father for the first time during his illness and for the last time in his life. The moment I saw him, I knew why I had put off this visit so long. I had told my mother that I did not want to see him because I hated him, but this was not true. It was only that I had hated him and I wanted to hold on to this hatred. I did not want to look on him as a ruin. It was not a ruin I had hated. I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense, once hate is gone, that they will be forced to deal with pain. We traveled out to him, his older sister and myself, to what seemed to be the very end of a very long island. It was a hot, It was hot and dusty, and we wrangled, my aunt and I, all the way out over the fact that I had recently begun to smoke, and as she said, to give myself airs. But I knew that she wrangled with me, because she could not bear to face the fact of her brother's dying. Neither could I endure the reality of her despair, her unstated bafflement as to what had happened to her brother's life, and her own. So we wrangled, and I smoked, and from time to time she fell into a heavy reverie. Covertly, I watched her face, which was the face of an old woman. It had fallen in, the eyes were sunken and lightless. Soon she would be dying too. In my childhood, it had not been so long ago, I had thought her beautiful. She had been quick-witted and quick-moving and very generous with all the children, and each of her visits had been an event. At one time, one of my brothers and myself had thought of running away to live with her. Now she could no longer produce out of her handbag some unexpected and yet familiar delight. She made me feel pity and revulsion and fear. It was awful to realize that she no longer caused me to feel affection. The closer we came to the hospital, the more querulous she became, and at the same time, naturally, grew more dependent on me. Between pity and guilt and fear, I began to feel that there was another me trapped in my skull, like a jack-in-the-box who might escape my control at any moment and fill the air with screaming. She began to cry the moment we entered the room, and she saw him lying there, all shriveled and still, like a little black monkey. The great gleaming apparatus which fed him and would have compelled him to be still, even if he had been able to move, brought to mind not beneficence, but torture. The tubes entering his arm made me think of pictures I had seen when a child of Gulliver tied down by the pygmies on that island. My aunt wept and wept. There was a whistling sound in my father's throat. Nothing was said. He could not speak. I wanted to take his hand, to say something, but I do not know what I could have said, even if he could have heard me. He was not really in that room with us. He had at last really embarked on his journey. And though my aunt told me that he was going to meet Jesus, I did not hear anything except that whistling in his throat. The doctor came back and we left, into that unbearable train again and home. In the morning came the telegram saying that he was dead. Then the house was suddenly full of relatives, friends, hysteria, and confusion, and I quickly left, my mother and the children, to the care of those impressive women who, in Negro communities at least, automatically appear at times of bereavement armed with lotions, proverbs, and patience, and an ability to cook. I went downtown. By the time I returned, later the same day, my mother had been carried to the hospital, and the baby had been born. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And what happens next in that text is it turns out that that is also the beginning of one of the terrible riots and uprisings, and that he has to make his way through the uprising. Anyway, so now we have Dickie Feeney, one of our great poets, winner of the National Book Award for Poetry a few years back, and she'll tell us what she's going to read.
Hello, everyone. Hello. This is an essay that has haunted me since I was 15, when an off-Broadway production company visited my tiny town of Sumter, South Carolina, and did a production of To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. And later I was gifted with the book To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. And this essay by James Baldwin begins that book. And it is also an essay that 40 years later I speak of in the introduction to Beacon Press's new volume of James Baldwin's poems, Jimmy's Blues. Sweet Lorraine. That's the way I always felt about her, and so I won't apologize for calling her that now. She understood it. In that far too brief a time when we walked and talked and laughed and drank together, sometimes in the streets and bars and restaurants of the village, sometimes at her house, sometimes at my house, sometimes gracelessly fleeing the houses of others, and sometimes seeming for anyone who didn't know us to be having a knock-down, drag-out battle. We spent a lot of time arguing about history and tremendously related subjects in her Bleecker Street and later Waverly Place flats. And often, just when I was certain that she was about to throw me out as being altogether too rowdy a type, she would stand up, her hands on her hips, For these down-home sessions, she always wore slacks. And pick up my empty glass as though she intended to throw it at me. Then she would walk into the kitchen saying with a haughty toss of her head, "Really, Jimmy, you ain't right, child." With which stern put-down, she would hand me another drink and launch into a brilliant analysis of just why I wasn't right. I would often stagger down her stairs as the sun came up, usually in the middle of a paragraph and always in the middle of a laugh, that marvelous laugh, that marvelous face. I loved her. She was my sister and my comrade. Her going did not so much make me lonely as make me realize how lonely we were. We had that respect for each other, which perhaps is only felt by people on the same side of the barricades, listening to the accumulating thunder of the hooves of horses and the treads of tanks. The first time I ever saw Lorraine was at the Actors Studio in the winter of 58-59. She was there as an observer of the workshop production of Giovanni's Room. She sat way up in the bleachers, taking on some of the biggest names in the American theater because she had liked the play and they, in the main, hadn't. I was enormously grateful to her. She seemed to speak for me. And afterward, she talked to me with a gentleness and generosity never to be forgotten. A small, shy, determined person with that strength dictated by absolutely impersonal ambition. She was not trying to make it. She was trying to keep the faith. We really met, however, in Philadelphia in 1959, when A Raisin in the Sun was at the beginning of its amazing career. Much has been written about this play. I personally feel that it will demand a far less guilty and constricted people than the present-day Americans to be able to assess it at all as an historical achievement. Anyway, no one can gainsay its importance. What is relevant here is that I had never in my life seen so many black people in the theater. And the reason was that never in the history of the American theater had so much of the truth of black people's lives been seen on the stage. Black people ignored the theater because the theater had always ignored them. But in Raisin, black people recognized that house and all the people in it, the mother, the son, the daughter, and the daughter-in-law, and supplied the play with an interpretive element which could not be present in the minds of white people, a kind of claustrophobic terror, created not only by their knowledge of the house, but by their knowledge of the streets. And when the curtain came down, Lorraine and I found ourselves in the backstage alley where she was immediately mobbed. I produced a pen, and Lorraine handed me her handbag and began signing autographs. "It only happens once," she said. I stood there and watched. I watched the people who loved Lorraine for what she had brought to them, and watched Lorraine who loved the people for what they brought to her. It was not for her a matter of being admired. She was being corroborated and confirmed. She was wise enough and honest enough to recognize that black American artists are in a very special case. One is not merely an artist, and one is not judged merely as an artist. The black people crowding around Lorraine, whether or not they considered her an artist, assuredly considered her a witness. This country's concept of art and artist has the effect, scarcely worth mentioning by now, of isolating the artist from the people. One can see the effect of this in the irrelevance of so much of the work produced by celebrated white artists. But the effect of this isolation on a black artist is absolutely fatal. He is already, as a black American citizen, isolated from most of his white countrymen. At the crucial hour, he can hardly look to his artistic peers for help, for they do not know enough about him to be able to correct him. To continue to grow, to remain in touch with himself, he needs the support of that community from which, however, all of the pressures of American life incessantly conspire to remove him. And when he is effectively removed, he falls silent, and the people have lost another hope. Much of the strain under which Lorraine worked was produced by her knowledge of this reality and her determined refusal to be destroyed by it. She was a very young woman with an overpowering vision, and fame had come to her early. She must certainly have wished often enough that fame had seen fit to drag its feet a little. For fame and recognition are not synonyms, especially not here. And her fame was to cause her to be criticized very harshly, very loudly, and very often by both black and white people who were unable to believe, apparently, that a really serious intention could be contained in so glamorous a frame. She took it all with a kind of astringent good humor, refusing, for example, even to consider defending herself when she was being accused of being a slumlord because of her family's real estate holdings in Chicago. I called her during that time, and all she said with a wry laugh was, "My God, Jimmy, do you realize you're only the second person who's called me today? And you know how my phone kept ringing off before." She was not surprised. She was devoted to the human race, but she was not romantic about it. When so bright a light goes out so early, when so gifted an artist goes so soon, we are left with a sorrow and wonder which speculation cannot assuage. One's filled for a long time with a sense of injustice as futile as it is powerful. And the vanished person fills the mind in this or that attitude, doing this or that. Sometimes very briefly, one hears the exact inflection of the voice, the exact timbre of the laugh, as I have when watching the dramatic presentation To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. And in reading through these pages, but I do not have the heart to presume to assess her work, for all of it, for me, was suffused with the light which was Lorraine. It is possible, for example, that the sign in Sidney Brustein's window attempts to say too much, but it is also exceedingly probable that it makes so loud and uncomfortable a sound because of the surrounding silence. Not many plays presently risk being accused of attempting to say too much. Again, Brustein is certainly a very willed play, unabashedly didactic, but it cannot, finally, be dismissed or categorized in this way because of the astonishing life of its people. It positively courts being dismissed as old-fashioned and banal, and yet has the unmistakable power of turning the viewer's judgment in on himself. Is all this true or not true? The play rudely demands, and unforgivably leaves us squirming before this question. One cannot quite answer the question negatively. One risks being caught in a lie. But an affirmative answer imposes a new level of responsibility, both for one's conduct and for the fortunes of the American state, and one risks, therefore, the disagreeable necessity of becoming an insurgent again. For Lorraine made no bones about asserting that art has a purpose, and that its purpose was action, that it contained the energy which could change things. It would be good, selfishly, to have her around now, that small, dark girl with her wit, her wonder, and her eloquent compassion. I've only met one person Lorraine couldn't get through to, and that was the late Bobby Kennedy. And as the years have passed since that stormy meeting, Lorraine talks about it in these pages, so I won't go into it here. I very often pondered what she then tried to convey, that a Holocaust is no respecter of persons, that what today seems merely humiliation and injustice for a few can, unchecked, become terror for the many. Snuffing out white lives, just as though they were black lives. That if the American state could not protect the lives of black citizens, then presently the entire state would find itself engulfed. And the horses and tanks are indeed upon us, and the end is not in sight. Perhaps it is just as well, after all, that she did not live to see with the outward eye what she saw so clearly with the inward one. And it is not at all far-fetched to suspect that what she saw contributed to the strain which killed her, for the effect to which Lorraine was dedicated is more than enough to kill a man. I saw Lorraine in her hospital bed as she was dying. She tried to speak. She couldn't. She did not seem frightened or sad, only exasperated that her body no longer obeyed her. She smiled and waved. But I prefer to remember her as she was the last time I saw her on her feet. We were at, of all places, the Pen Club. She was seated, talking, dressed all in black, wearing a very handsome, wide black hat, thin and radiant. I knew she had been ill, but I didn't know then how seriously. I said, "Lorraine, baby, you look beautiful. How in the world do you do it?" She was leaving. I have the impression she was on a staircase, and she turned and smiled that smile and said, "It helps to develop a serious illness, Jimmy," and waved and disappeared.
Thank you so much. For some reason, we don't have Marcus Gardley's bio on the piece of paper. We apologize to you. But just to say that Marcus is one of our finest young playwrights. I had the great good fortune of seeing his play of New Orleans in the 1830s and 1840s, The House That Will Not Stand, out of Berkeley Rep, and it's now being produced in New Haven, right?
It opened last night.
Did it open last night? How was that?
It was great.
He's written many, many other plays. Every Tongue Confess. He was a James Baldwin Fellow in 2012 at USA Arts, and is, in fact, he tells me, working on a James Baldwin-themed play, as we witness here. So here he is, Marcus Gardley.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I met James Baldwin in a college library when I was an undergrad, and I was a bit of a loner and still am, and books were my best friend. And I decided I was going to read all of the books in this particular library in the fiction section. And the good books would be my comrades. They would speak to me well into the night, and I would listen. And the bad books, we would just be acquaintances. And so I got through all the A's. It took me forever to get through all the A's. And I realized I can't really do this. I'm not going to make it. And then thank God Baldwin was an early B. So I picked up, I never forget, the first book was If Beale Street Could Talk. And I started to notice something was happening to me when I was reading this book. So then I read everything. I ravaged it all. I didn't even go to class. I read everything I could grab my hand on. And I realized I was actually listening to a voice that was my own. James Baldwin's father was a minister. My father's a minister. James Baldwin is witty. I'm a smartass. James Baldwin loves men. I love men. And James Baldwin moved to Paris and speaks French. So I changed my major. I did. I changed my major to French, and I studied French. And I was going to move to Paris, and I was going to be James Baldwin. And I got all the way to my 4th year, and I'm actually really good, surprisingly. I was really good at French. And my French advisor, she says, "You're one of our star students." She says, "But I have bad news. You don't have enough money to study in Paris. Because the final year to complete the major in this particular university, you had to study abroad." And so I was devastated that I couldn't study. So I took a year off and worked. And I decided for fun I would take a playwriting class. And within the first week, I realized that I was a writer. And this was my connection to Baldwin. So I thank Baldwin so much for that. I'm going to read an essay that's called "A Talk to Teachers." And Baldwin delivered this on October 16th, 1963. And he entitled it at the time, "The Negro Child, His Self-Image." Since I am talking to school teachers, and I am not a teacher myself, and in some ways am fairly easily intimidated, I beg you to let me leave that and go back to what I think to be the entire purpose of education. It would seem to me that when a child is born, if I'm the child's parent, It is my obligation and my high duty to civilize that child. Man is a social animal. He cannot exist without a society. A society, in turn, depends on certain things, which everyone within that society takes for granted. Now, the crucial paradox which confronts us here is that the whole process of education occurs within a social framework and is designed to perpetuate the aims of society. Thus, for example, the boys and girls who were born during the era of the Third Reich, when educated to the purpose of the Third Reich, became barbarians. The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. The purpose of education, finally, is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say to himself that is black or that is white, to decide for himself whether there is a God in heaven or not, to ask questions of the universe and then learn to live with those questions is the way he achieves his own identity. But no society is really anxious to have that kind of person around. What societies really, ideally want is a citizenry, which will simply obey the rules of society. If a society succeeds in this, that society is about to perish. The obligation of anyone who thinks of himself as responsible is to examine society and try to change it and to fight it at no matter what risk. This is the only hope society has. This is the only way societies change. Now, if what I have tried to sketch has any validity, it becomes thoroughly clear, at least to me, that any Negro who is born in this country and undergoes the American educational system runs the risk of becoming schizophrenic. On the one hand, he is born in the shadow of the Stars and Stripes, and he is assured it represents a nation which has never lost a war. He pledges allegiance to that flag, which guarantees liberty and justice for all. He is part of a country in which anyone can become president and so forth. But on the other hand, he is also assured by his country and his countrymen that he has never contributed anything to civilization, that his past is nothing more than a record of humiliations, gladly endured. He is assumed by the Republic that he, his father, his mother, and his ancestors were happy, shiftless, watermelon-eating darkies who loved Mr. Charlie and Miss Ann, that the value he has as a black man is proven by one thing only, his devotion to white people. If you think I am exaggerating, examine the myths which proliferate in this country about Negroes. All this enters the child's consciousness much sooner than we as adults would like to think it does. As adults, we are easily fooled because we are so anxious to be fooled. But children are very different. Children, not yet aware that it is dangerous to look too different, children not yet aware that it is dangerous to look too deeply at anything, look at everything. They look at each other and draw their own conclusions. They don't have the vocabulary to express what they see, and we, their elders, know how to intimidate them very easily and very soon. But a black child, looking at the world around him, though he cannot quite know what to make of it, is aware that there is a reason why his mother works so hard, why his father is always on the edge. He is aware that there is some reason why, if he sits down in front of the bus, his father or mother slaps him and drags him to the back. He is aware that there is some terrible weight of his parents on his parents' shoulder, which menaces him. And it isn't long, in fact, it begins when he is in school, before he discovers the shape of his oppression. Let us say that the child is 7 years old and I am his father, and I decide to take him to the zoo, or to Madison Square Garden, or to the UN building, or to any of the tremendous monuments we find all over New York City. We get into a bus, and we go from where I live on 131st Street and 7th Avenue, downtown through the park, and we get into New York City, which is not Harlem. Now, where the boy lives, even if it is a housing project, it is an undesirable neighborhood. If he lives in one of these housing projects, of which everyone in New York is so proud, he has at the front door, if not closer, the pimps, the whores, the junkies. In a word, the danger of life in the ghetto. And the child knows this, though he doesn't know why. I still remember my first sight of New York. It was really another city when I was born, where I was born. We looked down over the Park Avenue streetcars. The Park Avenue I grew up on, which is still standing, is dark and dirty. No one would dream of opening a Tiffany's on that Park Avenue. And when you go downtown, you discover that you are literally in the white world. It is rich, or at least it looks rich. It is clean because they collect garbage downtown. There are doormen. People walk about as though they owned where they are, and indeed they do. And it's a great shock. It's very hard to relate yourself to this. You don't know what it means. You know instinctively that none of this is for you. You know this before you are told. And what is it for? And who is paying for it? And why isn't it for you? Every street boy, and I was a street boy, so I know, looking at the society which has produced him, looking at the standards of that society, which are not honored by anybody, looking at your churches and the government and the politicians, understand that this structure is operated for someone else's benefit, not for his. And there's no reason in it for him. If he really is cunning, really ruthless, really strong, and many of us are, he becomes a kind of criminal. He becomes a kind of criminal because that's the only way he can live. Harlem and every ghetto in this city, every ghetto in this country, is full of people who live outside the law. They wouldn't dream of calling a policeman. They wouldn't for a moment listen to any of those professions of which we are so proud of on the 4th of July. They have turned away from this country forever and totally. They live by their wits and really long to see the day when the entire structure comes down. In order for me to live, I decided very early that some mistake had been made somewhere. I was not a nigger, even though they called me one. But if I was a nigger in your eyes, there was something about you. There was something about you that was needed. I had to realize when I was very young that I was none of those things that I was told. I was not, for example, happy. I never touched a watermelon for all kinds of reasons that had been invented by white people. And I knew enough about life by this time to understand that whatever you invent, whatever you project, is you. So where we are in the country of people believe, so where we are in this country, people believe I'm a nigger, and I don't. And the battle's on. Because if I am not what I've been told I am, then it means that you're not what you thought you were either. And that is the crisis. It is not really a Negro revolution that is upsetting this country. What is upsetting this country is a sense of its own identity. If, for example, one managed to change the curriculum in all the schools so that Negroes learned more about themselves and their real contributions to this culture, you will be liberating not only Negroes, you'll be liberating white people who know nothing about their own history. And the reason is this. If you are compelled to lie about one aspect of anybody's history, you must lie about it all. If you have to lie about my real role here, if you have to pretend that I hold all that cotton just because I loved you, then you don't have something to yourself, and you are mad. All this means that there are in this country tremendous reservoirs of bitterness, which have never been able to find an outlet, but may find an outlet soon. It means that well-meaning white liberals place themselves in great danger when they try to deal with Negroes as though they were missionaries. It means, in brief, that a great price is demanded to liberate all those silent people so that they can breathe for the first time and tell you what they think of. And a price is demanded to liberate all these children, some of them near 40, who have never grown up and who will never know because they have no sense of their own identity. Who passes for identity in America is a series of myths about one's heroic ancestors. It's astounding to me, for example, that so many people really appear to believe that the country was founded by a band of heroes who wanted to be free. That happens not to be true. What happened was that some people left Europe because they couldn't stay there any longer and had to go someplace else to make it. That's all. They were hungry, they were poor, they were convicts. Those who were making it in England, for example, did not get on the Mayflower. That's how the country was settled, not by Gary Cooper. Yet we have a whole race of people, a whole republic, who believe the myths to the point where even today They select political representatives, as far as I can tell, by how closely they resemble Gary Cooper. Now, this is dangerously infantile, and it shows in every level of national life. When I was living in Europe, for example, one of the worst revelations to me was the way Americans walked around Europe buying this and buying that and insulting everybody. Not even out of malice, just because they didn't know any better. Well, this is the way they always have treated me. They weren't cruel. They just didn't know you were alive. They didn't know you had feelings. The Bible says somewhere that where there is no vision, the people perish. I don't think anyone can doubt that in this country today, we are menaced, intolerably menaced, by a lack of vision. Thank you.
Marcus, how long was the play playing in Longworth? 2 weeks. 2 weeks. So you.
I did one in Brooklyn.
Oh, and tell us about that.
At the Irondale, it's called The Box. It's about black people who are incarcerated.
What's the name of it?
It's called The Box.
Just say it again.
Okay, so please come out. Thank you so much for being here. Please come out. The play is called The Box. It's at the Irondale, 85 South Oxford Street, and it runs to May 11th.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And one of our finest playwrights, John Guare.
I was raving to Ren about Another Country, which I just had reread recently, and it just bowled me over. And he said, we have to be part of this, Jimmy at noon. So here I am, and I'm very grateful to him and to be on this panel. And how horrible it is to hear what Marcus just read and what Nikky just read. How it's still alive. I mean, the voice still speaks today. It is not. You said, oh, that was such a different time. That's the horror of it. We're still in a version of that time. I'm going to read from Another Country. What fascinated me about this book, which was written in 1960, is that its epigraph, it begins with an epigraph by Henry James, of all people. And Henry James wrote at the beginning of this novel, they strike one above all as giving no account of themselves in any terms already consecrated by human use. To this inarticulate state they probably form collectively the most unprecedented of monuments, abysmal the mystery of what they think, what they feel, what they want, what they suppose themselves to be saying. Henry James, I don't know what he was writing this in reference to, but it speaks for the voice that James Baldwin was giving to a good portion of America. I'm reading from book 1. It's called Easy Rider, and that begins with a quote from W.C. Handy. I told him Easy Rider's got to stay away, so he had to vamp it, but the hike ain't far. I'm going to read a passage about the hike that a certain Rufus takes, a young black drummer. This scene, which ends book 1, which to me, I mean, I shouldn't give reviews before, but it's the only other equal is Don DeLillo's opening of Underworld. It's just one of those extraordinary passages of American literature that can't get buried. And it begins in a bar in the 1940s, downtown in the Village, I guess probably like a version of the Lion's Head. And we're going to focus on Rufus, who was the young black drummer. And all his friends are varying shades of, he's the only black man in this world. Rufus thought of afternoons and evenings on the stand when people had come up to him to bawl their appreciation and to prophesy that he would do great things. They had bugged him then. Yet how he wished now to be back there, to have someone looking at him as Vivaldo now looked at Richard, a young writer. And how he looked at Vivaldo's face in which affection and something coldly speculative battled. He was happy for Richard's triumph over his book, but perhaps he wished it were his own. And at the same time, he wondered what order of triumph it was. And the way that people had looked at Rufus was not unlike this look. They wondered where it came from, this force that they admired. Dimly, they wondered how soon he stood it. They wondered how he stood it, wondered if perhaps it would not kill him soon. I'll jump ahead. You look great. You look great, said Vivaldo briefly. For the first time, she looked directly at Rufus. She looked directly at him. Do I? Do I? Well, I guess I've been feeling pretty well. I've cut down on my drinking. And she laughed a little too loudly and looked down. Richard was paying the waiter and had stood up, his trench coat over his own. Are you leaving? Well, we've got to, said Cass. We're just dull, untalented, old married people. Cass glanced over at Rufus, saying, well, be good now. Get home, rest. Get some rest. And she smiled at him. He longed to do something to prolong that smile, that moment, but he did not smile back, only nodded his head. She turned to Jane and Vivaldo. Well, so long, kids. See you soon. Yeah, sure, Jane said. I'll be over tomorrow, said Vivaldo. Yeah, I'm expecting you, Richard said. Don't fail me. So long, Jane. So long, so long. Everybody was gone now except Jane and Rufus and Vivaldo. And we go to Rufus's mind. I wouldn't mind being in jail, but I've got to stay there so long. The seats the others had occupied were like a chasm now between Rufus and the white boy and the white girl. Let's have another drink, Vivaldo said. So long, so long. Let me buy, Jane said. I sold a painting. Did you now? For a lot of money? Oh, quite a lot of money. That's probably why I was in such a stinking mood the last time you saw me. It wasn't going well. Well, you were in a stinking mood, all right. Well, your Rufus wouldn't mind being in jail. What are you having, Rufus? Oh, I'll stick to scotch, I guess. But I've got to stay there. I'm sorry, Jane said. I don't know what makes me such a bitch. Well, you drink too much. Let's just have one drink here, then I'll walk you home. They both looked quickly at Rufus. So long, so long. I'm going to the head, Rufus said. Order me a scotch with water. He walked out of the back room into the roaring bar. He stood at the door for a moment, watching the boys and girls, men and women, their wet mouths opening and closing, their faces damp and pale, their hands grim on the glass or the bottle, or clutching a sleeve, an elbow, clutching the air. Small flames flared incessantly here and there, and they moved through shifting layers of smoke. The cash register rang and rang. One enormous bouncer stood at the door watching everything, and another moved about, clearing tables and rearranging chairs. Two boys, one Spanish-looking in a red shirt, one Danish-looking in brown, stood at the jukebox talking about Frank Sinatra. Rufus stared at a small blonde girl who was wearing a striped open blouse and a wide skirt with a big leather belt and a bright brass buckle. She wore low shoes and black knee socks. Her blouse was low enough for him to see the beginnings of her breasts. His eye followed the line down to the full nipples, which pushed aggressively forward. His hand circled her waist, caressed her belly button, and slowly forced her thighs apart. She was talking to another girl. She felt his eyes on her and looked his way. Their eyes met. He turned and walked into the head. It smelled of thousands of travelers, oceans of piss, tons of bile and vomit and shit. He added his stream to the ocean, holding that most despised part of himself loosely between two fingers of one hand. But I've got to stay there so long. He looked at the horrible history splashed furiously on the walls, telephone numbers, cocks, breasts, balls, cunts, etched into these walls with a hatred. Suck my cock. I like to get whipped. I want a hot, stiff prick up my ass. Down with Jews. Kill the niggers. I suck cocks. He washed his hands very carefully and dried them on the filthy roller towel and walked out into the bar. The boys were still at the jukebox. The girl with the striped blouse was still talking to a friend. He walked through the bar to the door and turned into the street. Only then did he reach into his pocket to see what Cass had pushed into his palm. $5. Well, that would take care of him until morning. He would get a room at the Y. He crossed Sheridan Square and walked slowly along West 4th Street. The bars were beginning to close. People stood before bar doors trying vainly to get in or simply delaying going home. And in spite of the cold, there were loiterers under street lamps. He felt as removed from them as he walked slowly along as he might have felt from a fence, a farmhouse, a tree, seen from a train window, coming closer and closer, the details changing every instant as the eye picked them out, then pressing against the window with the urgency of a messenger or a child, then dropping away, diminishing, vanished, gone forever. That fence is falling down, he thought. He might have thought as the train rushed toward it. Or, that house needs paint. Or, look, the tree is dead. In an instant, gone in an instant. It was not his fence. his farmhouse or his tree. As now passing, he recognized faces, bodies, postures, and thought, oh, that's Ruth. Oh, there's old Lenny. Son of a bitch is stoned again. It was very silent. Past Cornelia Street. Cornelia Street. Eric had once lived there. He saw again the apartment, the lamplight in the corner, Eric under the bed, books falling over everything, and the bed unmade. Eric, and he was on 6th Avenue, traffic lights, and the lights of taxis blazing around him. 2 girls and 2 boys, white, stood on the opposite corner, waiting for the lights to change. Half a dozen men in a heavy, gleaming car rolled by and shouted at them. Then there was something on his shoulder, a young white boy in a vaguely military cap and a black leather jacket. He looked at Rufus with the greatest hostility, then started slowly down the avenue away from him, waving his rump like a flag. He looked back, stopped beneath the marquee of a movie theater. The lights changed. Rufus and the 2 couples started toward each other, came abreast in the middle of the avenue, passed. Only one of the girls looked at him with a kind of pitying wonder in her eyes. All right, bitch. He started toward A Street for no reason. He was simply putting off his subway ride. Then he stood at the subway steps looking down. For a wonder, especially at this hour, there was no one on the steps. The steps were empty. He wondered if the man in the booth would change his $5 bill. He started down. Then as the man gave him change and he moved toward the turnstile, other people came in, rushing loud, pushing past him as though they were swimmers and he was nothing but an upright pole in the water. Then something began to awaken in him, something new. It increased his distance and increased his pain. They were rushing the platform to the tracks, something he had not thought of for many years, something he had never ceased to think of came back to him as he walked behind the crowd. The subway platform was a dangerous place, so he had always thought. It sloped downward toward the waiting tracks, and when he had been a little boy and stood on the platform beside his mother, he had not dared let go her hand. He stood on the platform now, alone with these people, who were each other of them alone, and waited in a quiet calmness for the train. But suppose something somewhere failed, and the yellow lights went out, and no one could see any longer the platform's edge. Suppose these beams fell down. He saw the train in the tunnel rushing underwater, the motorman gone mad, gone blind, unable to decipher the lights, and the tracks gleaming and snarling senselessly upward forever. The train never stopping, and the people screaming at windows and doors and turning on each other with all the accumulated fury of their blasphemed lives, everything gone out of them but murder, breaking limb from limb and splashing in blood, with joy, for the first time, joy after such a long sentence in chains, leaping out to astound the world again. Or the train in the tunnel, the water outside, the power failing, the walls coming in, and the water not rising like a flood, but breaking like a wave over the heads of these people, filling their crying mouths, filling their eyes, their hair, tearing away their clothes, and discovering the secrecy which only the water by now could use. It could happen. It could happen. And he would have loved to have seen it happen, even if he perished too. The train came in, filling the great scar of the tracks. They all got on sitting in the lighted car, which was far from empty, which would be choked with people before they got very far uptown, or stood or sat in the isolation cell into which they transformed every inch of space they held. The train stopped at 14th Street. He was sitting at the window and he watched a few people get on. There's a colored girl among them who looked a little like his sister, but she looked at him and looked away and sat down as far from him as she could. The train rolled on through the tunnel. The next stop was 34th Street, his stop. People got on. He watched the stop roll by. 42nd Street. This time a crowd got on, some of them carrying papers, and there were no seats left. A white man leaned on a strap near him. Rufus felt his gorge rise. At 59th Street, many came on board, and many rushed across the platform to the waiting local. Many white people and many black people chained together in time and in space and by history, and all of them in a hurry to get away from each other, he thought, but we ain't never gonna make it. We've been fucked for fair. Then the doors slammed a loud sound, and it made him jump. The train, as though protesting its heavier burden, as though protesting the proximity of white buttock to black knee, groaned, lurched. The wheels seemed to scrape the track, making a tearing sound. Then it began to move uptown where the masses would divide and the load become lighter. Lights flared and teetered by. They passed other platforms where people waited for other trains. Then they had the tunnel to themselves. The train rushed into the blackness with a phallic abandon into the blackness which opened to receive it. Opened, the whole world shook with their coupling. Then when it seemed that the roar and the movement would never cease, they came into the bright lights of 125th Street. The train gasped and moaned to a halt. He thought that he would get off here, but he watched the people move towards the door, watched the doors open, watched them leave. It was mainly black people who left. He had thought that he would get off here and go home. But he watched the girl who reminded him of his sister as she moved sullenly past white people and stood for a moment on the platform before walking toward the steps. Suddenly he knew that he was never going home anymore. The train began to move, half empty now, and with each stop it became lighter. Soon the white people who were left looked at him oddly. He felt their stares, but he felt far away from them. You took the best, so why not take the rest? He got off at the station named for the bridge built to honor the father of his country, and walked up the steps into the streets, which were empty. Tall apartment buildings, lightless, loomed against the dark sky and seemed to be watching him, seemed to be pressing down on him. The bridge was nearly over his head, intolerably high, but he did not yet see the water. He felt it, he smelled it. He thought how he had never before understood how an animal could smell water. But it was over there, past the highway, where he could see the speeding cars. Then he stood on the bridge, looking over, looking down. Now the lights of the cars on the highway seemed to be writing an endless message, writing with awful speed in a fine, unreadable script. There were muted lights on the Jersey shore, and here and there a neon flame advertising something somebody had for sale. He began to walk slowly to the center of the bridge, observing that from this height, the city which had been so dark as he walked through it seemed to be on fire. He stood at the center of the bridge, and it was freezing cold. He raised his eyes to heaven. He thought, you bastard, you motherfucking bastard, ain't I your baby too? He began to cry. Something in Rufus which could not break shook him like a rag doll and splashed salt water all over his face and filled his throat and his nostrils with anguish. He knew the pain would never stop. He could never go down into the city again. He dropped his head as though someone had struck him and looked down at the water. It was cold, and the water would be cold. He was black, and the water was black. He lifted himself by his hands on the rail, lifted himself as high as he could, and leaned far out. The wind tore at him, at his head, his shoulders, while something in him screamed, why? Why? He thought of Eric, his straining arms threatened to break. I can't make it this way. He thought of Ida. He whispered, I'm sorry, Leona. And then the wind took him, and he felt himself going over, head down, the wind, the stars, the lights, the water, all rolled together. All right. He felt a shoe fly off behind him. There was nothing around him, only the wind. All right, you motherfucker.